Hello, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We'll be getting started exactly at 4 p.m. Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you. As you're coming in, please feel free to say hi in the chat box. We'll be starting exactly at 4 p.m. As people are coming in, I just want to say once again, thank you for joining us. And let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello and welcome. My name is Althea Rowe, and thank you again for joining us for this 30-minute webinar in our Research to Policy Critical Conversations in Language Education series. This year's theme is Technologically Mediated Learning in Multilingual Contexts. We are examining the impact of technological innovation on learning in multilingual settings with a particular focus on AI. Today's webinar is Bias in Automatic Speech Recognition, the Case of African American Language. And we will be speaking with Kelly Wright from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Joshua Martin from the Center for Online Innovation and Production, and we will also be joined by Shondell Nero from New York University and a CAL board member, and Kia Johnson from Center for Applied Linguistics. We are recording this webinar and will post the recording on our website after the event. Before we begin, please mute your microphones to avoid interruptions. You can activate closed captioning by pressing the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. This event is provided as a public service. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the guest speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of our organization. Our panel comprised of esteemed experts who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in language education, language access, and equity. You can learn more from them on the webinar's webpage. We will be sharing the page in the chat. We do encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box throughout the call. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of that discussion. It is an excellent opportunity for you to tap into the wealth of knowledge we are fortunate to have here today. Also, click the chat button at the bottom of your screen to share your thoughts and comments anytime. Try it out right now by letting us know where you're listening from today. And with that being said, I will hand it over to our panel.
Thank you, Althea, and thank you, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today. We are blessed with two wonderful guest speakers who have been doing amazing research on their topic for today, automatic recognition, speech recognition software, and bias with African American language. My name is Shondell Nero. I'm a faculty at New York University and the Teaching and TESOL program. And I would like to start by asking our two guests my first question, which is to tell us a little bit about the research that you've done with automatic speech recognition software with respect to African American language. And what do you see are those findings as they have implications for interactions with speakers of non-standard varieties of language? Who wants to go first? Kelly?
Sure, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for being here. This work with Josh really does represent my extent of research with automatic speech recognition specifically. A lot of the work that I've done as a sociolinguist is looking at the ways in which African American language users and just non-standard language users interact with all sorts of institutions, and technology just happens to be one of them. So yeah, we were excited to kind of come together on this project and sort of bring two different ends of the field into conversation.
Yeah, and this was a little bit of when we kind of ventured out to work on this. It was at the time it was not a so well studied field. The field, this intersection of sociolinguistics, the examination of technological systems, particularly speech recognition systems, and the intersection of racial identity was not so well researched. And so we sought to kind of figure those things out. You know, Kelly's expertise is really wonderful in the sociolinguistic aspect in that intersection with technology. And, you know, we were able to kind of look at the ways that African American language has been discriminated against, or you know, the sorts of biases that speakers of the varieties of African American language face in human to human interactions, or in human to institutions made of human interactions, and to draw upon the sociolinguistic studies that have been done in the past to kind of project into the future and say, okay, if these are the types of things that these folks have faced in the past, what if those same sorts of biases were to be translated into these technologies, as we've seen, you know, along with works in other fields like algorithmic bias and things like that for other technologies that other folks have uncovered. If those same biases and those interactions were translated into these speech recognition systems, how would that affect people's lives? And so that's kind of the direction of the paper is that we collaborated on, was to define those biases, to give like those definitions to, and to kind of explore different areas of people's lives where that could impact them.
And just to push a little bit, Kelly, and what were some of, what did you sort of find just in that initial work, and how do you think that might affect everyday, not just African Americans, but speakers of other non-standard varieties, vernacular varieties?
Yeah, thank you so much. So our work really focuses on how bias functions in two ways. We're looking at the imbalance of data sets, which simply don't have representative or complete training data, and thus like aren't able to function optimally. And we're looking at like the sense of discrimination against groups of people who speak a certain way. Your question asking about how these things influence everyday users, it's certainly not just something that is an issue for Black people. And language-based issues with automatic speech recognition aren't just about inconvenience. We describe the ways in which decision-making algorithms are shown to have negative biases in areas like autonomous vehicles, which have problems like seeing or hearing people of color, speech detection, which typically relies on pitch, our search engines, which send us targeted ads and services, facial recognition technology, which law enforcement uses to track down protesters. So there's just lots of different ways that every single one of us who interact with technology every day kind of are influenced by these underrepresented data sets.
Great, and not just in the software. I'm just quickly reminded of the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, where the chief witness, who was here just before he died, was an African American woman whose entire testimony was sort of disregarded because she was an AVE speaker. So in real life, these biases have real consequences here in the law. Yes, let me turn that over to Kia to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. I was going to say that's a great segue into my question here, because this year our topics have been focusing around 4 categories of looking at access, representation, systems, and structures, and how AI and its technology is impacting one of those areas. So tell us a little about how you feel that the research on African American languages and the racial biases in automatic speech recognition addresses that systems category, particularly in terms of transforming language learning and its use, or addresses any of the other 3 categories as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this research in its interdisciplinary nature kind of touches all of those different areas, right? And, you know, in terms of this, specifically the systematic aspect of it, you could kind of view it in different layers of systems, right? So when we were looking at speech data sets, so basically audio data that's used to train models. You know, we've now moved more into large language models for generative AI and things like that, and the same principles apply. These large AI models are trained upon data sets. And when you look into the speech recognition data sets used to train these systems, a lot of these systems don't necessarily have the linguistic variation that's needed to be able to process well or correctly the speech of marginalized voices, for example, speakers of African American languages. But, you know, beyond that, also it could apply to, you know, Kelly and I are both originally from the South, and speak varieties of Southern English, and those unique linguistic features that are within the linguistic repertoire there would also be likely not very recognizable to the systems. And that goes back to those linguistic structures not being represented within the data sets, right? So while the paper we collaborated on was a more theoretical paper and an ethics paper about how this could affect people's lives, when we looked at the data sets, we looked at particular morphosyntactic features of African American language, and in that way tried to take a more linguistic and sociolinguistic approach, not just saying like, are there Black speakers within this data set, but is there a variation in the way that both Black and non-Black speakers speak, and is the data set accurately or, you know, having enough instances of those features to be able to understand what those features are, what they mean, to even be able to transcribe it correctly, right? And, you know, and you move on from the data sets themselves into the way that the speech recognition systems work. And if the data is not there, they just don't process it well. And then if they're not processing it well, then the way that those technologies are used within systems, you know, in our paper, we talked about healthcare interactions and then also job interviews. If those systems are being applied in those settings and they're not, you know, functioning correctly for folks whose main linguistic varieties use those features, then they're getting a subpar experience and experiencing, you know, representative and allocational harms. They're not getting equitable treatment, right? And so at every layer there's a system, and in each of those systems that bias is causing a flawed experience for that particular individual or those communities. So I don't know if you want to add to that, Kelly.
Thank you. I feel like most of what I feel like is important about this conversation you just shared. When we think about the systems, the actual automatic speech recognition system, it really is this idea that they're trained to analyze speech, but they're designed to analyze speech, but they're trained on large bodies of text, at least initially, at least primarily. And we know that, you know, Black people in this country were legally barred from reading and writing for 2 centuries. So you could feed these models every single sentence that was ever printed by African Americans, and the imbalance would remain in these systems because it's just put to use in a place that has been, you know, designed to restrict the self-determination of Black people. But Josh is absolutely right that it's not just you know, the linguistic production of African Americans that's not represented on like all of Google Books or some of these other large bodies of text that these programs are trained on. It's lots of people. It's housewives. It's folks from the South. It's the elderly. And when you think about the ways in which those groups of people, you know, need to access healthcare, need to access housing, might represent themselves in a courtroom and hope that you know, their language is being taken down accurately, are trying to find jobs. We already know that lots of inequity exists in these systems. And so we're really asking the question of how can these models, like as they stand now, aid folks? Like the ethical question is like, can they without, you know, serious editing?
Absolutely. So that's actually a really good segue there. I think that Shondell will have you all kind of expound on that and talk a little bit about it. So I'll let her lead with the next question.
So, when we think about all of the implications for, like you said, regular folk in so many aspects of life, beyond, we're sort of formal education, but you said in the court and so forth. What would you like to see change in terms of policy policy and practice that can be done to help to diminish, if not eradicate, these biases and harms that are caused by, like you said, not having a representative sample in the software to begin with? Whoever can go first. Yeah.
You
Joshua?
gonna go first, Kelly?
Mhm.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So in terms of it all comes back to the data sets are the training data sets are kind of the DNA of the systems, right? They are the origin. They are the place that, everything kind of comes together, right? And so there are, ways that folks could be more transparent about that. If policies were in place to say, okay, if you have a speech recognition system that you are using in proprietary software, then you have to make transparent the data sets that were used to train that system. And there could be ways to say, like, okay, you have to have these parameters, right? You have to meet these thresholds of, there needs to be this amount of these graphics of speakers. If we were living in a what we could get policy wise exactly what we wanted, that would extend to linguistic variety too. Not just demographics in terms of sociological factors, but these intersections of social linguistics, those very specific morphosyntactic, phonological kinds of varieties as well. And doing that, having that sort of transparency would, in terms of like having an actual policy that was enforceable, would force people to kind of go back in and reevaluate those things and possibly like restructure the algorithms that they use and rebuild the systems from the ground up in a more equitable manner. And I do think that it probably does come from policy, right? It's not, these things are things that we're talking about to make life more equitable for folks who don't have access to various resources in their lives, right? It's one of the issues is that if you can code switch well, like if you have been given access through whatever educational system you went through or whatever, and you had gained access to standardized American English, then you have a better shot at being able to code switch from your, native linguistic variety, right? Like I personally had to, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi, and I had to, over the years, learn standardized American English through, very strained ways and learned how to apply that in various situations because the linguistic varieties I grew up with were more discriminated against in the academic settings or professional settings that I grew up in. And that was a privilege that I was given, and many folks aren't given those privileges. And so these policies would be for those folks to say, like, no, you come as you are with who you are and what you have, and the system will work the same for you. Like you're getting the same sort of experience as those who might have privileges that you might not have been allowed for various reasons. Do you want to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree that this idea of like come as you are is so much of what I would love to see just in general when we're talking about linguistic equity, not necessarily just interfacing with technology, but in all the things that we do. We shouldn't have to accommodate to one particular variety, one preferred variety to do anything, to do self, to interact with institutions, especially to meet our basic needs. But I like the kind of like come as you are idea too, about thinking about how these systems are built, because gathering like exclusively larger and more representative data sets isn't the magic pill to solve how these systems work. So I think requirements or expectations, especially in our publications, or holding corporations, like proprietary software, to a higher standard of saying, I need a positionality statement from you. I need to know what you're coming into this conversation with. I need more explicit description of your training data sets. I need to know what kinds of specific questions and tasks the software has been given when it's analyzing my speech, when it's being applied in hiring, when it's being applied in healthcare. I need to know what it's listening for. I need to know who built this and why they built it. And especially when we have researchers who are pulling down, like open data sources and applying them to research questions, I want that background from them as well, to be like, here is the source, here is what it's built, here's everything that I can tell you about where these text sources came from. I realize that a lot of that is right now in the work we're seeing currently, and Josh is right that this has expanded so much. Like in the 2 years, since we submitted this paper, it's a different field. It is a field, right, in a way that it wasn't before. And I just would like to see, as it's growing, like much more accountability and representation of the humans that are behind these systems, because I think part of what makes them dangerous is that there's an assumption of objectivity underneath them that just like simply doesn't exist.
So we need to go back and retrain Alexis, right?
Honestly.
We're both like,
Yes.
uh-huh.
Uh-huh. Like, hello. Yeah, and that is like you said, you did this paper 2 years ago, and I'm just thinking of like, where was AI 2 years ago to today? And so if you were to do that paper today, I'd be so interested to see like even more of like how big is the gap in that bias now from then to now with all of the expansions they've already added to AI. And that kind of segues into what my next question is, because we're talking about what changes we would like to see. Tie that to now for us, what would be your call to action so that we can address some of these biases in the language technologies? How can we promote more equitable, inclusive practices in this technology to make sure that our underrepresented linguistic communities are represented here?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I feel like for me, one thing is we're all more than one thing. So in this paper, we're talking about people producing a very specific variety of African-American language, like one that is perhaps standardized in its own right, like when they interact with technology. But the research just like simply hasn't been done to demonstrate the intersectionality of individuals, that how like Black women or Black queer people or like rural older queer people like interact with technology. And so we issue a call at the end of this paper for exactly that type of work, because we like desperately need to understand the likelihood of equitable outcomes for anyone who interacts with these models and their supportive technologies, and who move through various institutions which incorporate them every single day. And we need to do like the collective work of creating academic and professional incentives for publicizing this type of research, like research that can be immediately applied to deepening real world problems, because as we see, it moves very quickly.
Yeah. And just one like very practical example in the paper, we talk about automated bias, and that's the idea that if it's produced by an AI system, we just kind of naturally think that it's right, because computers are smarter than us.
Yes.
And that's just like a natural bias we all have within us. And I was talking to a friend of mine who is almost finished her schooling in nurse practitioning, and she was talking about working with patients and how doctors spend an inordinate amount of time working on their medical notes, and that is just like a constant problem that's plaguing medical doctors. And one way that they've addressed this over the years is hiring medical scribes. But what if you don't have the budget or the resources to be able to hire an extra person to do your notes? Well, one very easy solution is AI now, right? And so one of the things that we talk about in our extended research is the potentiality of you and your doctor together having this conversation about what's going on with you, and there's a smart speaker between you. taking notes basically on what you're saying. And she literally said, we're implementing the place that I'm working, we're implementing this exact software. So 2 years ago, that wasn't a reality. Now it's happening in real life. And so I was talking to her and saying, oh, actually, we, my co-author and I researched this and talked about how if these sorts of systems are biased in this way, that could really distort, a patient who speaks these varieties. The speaker could be misinterpreting the meaning of what they're saying by misinterpreting their literal speech, and how that could change the medical notes, that when the doctor goes back to kind of like figure out the plan of treatment for that patient, could impact them in a negative way. So even, and when we were talking about it, she was like, oh, like I never thought about that. And I need to, I'll keep that in mind when we're using this AI software. I'll remember, go back and check it, And so I honestly think at a ground level, just like awareness, because it's like people just don't know that this is a thing, So even talking to like, thinking about like, oh, if the place that you work is saying, oh, we're going to move into hiring practices that use hiring AI systems, just being able to go to your boss and be like, hey, have you heard about the potential of bias in these things? Just like awareness in those things, I think can help people step back and think, oh, actually, maybe I shouldn't just assume that this is going to be an equitable solution for everyone. Maybe I should dig deeper into this and figure out if this is actually going to do a good job. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I might add that bias is across languages, right? It's not just with English, right? We've had varieties of Spanish, for example. We've had cases in New York where, I need a Spanish person because I have a Mexican patient. And it's like, well, turns out that the person's from Mexico, but they're speaking an indigenous language. And secondly, it doesn't sound like Dominican Spanish or Puerto Rican Spanish. And so just as much of the variation, for equity, it needs to happen with English. It's really a larger problem than just the language. It's just, like you said, normalizing variation in language, which is really normalizing variation in people, is really key. I think, do we have questions?
We do have some questions in the Q&A. So I don't know if Shondell, you want to choose one and I choose one. I think we've got time to ask maybe one each if we do very brief responses.
There's a question here from Holly. What laws or policies do you suggest to assure that this version of institutionalized racism is not able to be continued? Big question from Holly. What laws or policies? Well, one suggested about
one.
but if we get into laws, any bright ideas from you guys about?
Or have you heard of any that are being developed or in a pipeline somewhere to try to address some of these inequities?
Right. With
So
technology.
That's a good question. So there are, I think, one place that you mentioned, Shondell, earlier about the Rickford and King paper on the Zimmerman trial. I think I'm pretty sure that there was an earlier version of this paper that we talked about courtroom biases too. I think that that's this huge area that we already know is really, really fraught, where these softwares are being incorporated for this like sense of objectivity, but there are a few policies, especially in Europe, that are looking at completely removing AI from the courtroom, and even in like pre-trial assessments. So sometimes like a criminal's background is like put through a system that gives you or gives a judge like suggestions for punishment. And so this idea of saying like, okay, we ran this person's like history, which includes statements that they've made that have been written down and or transcribed by AI, into a system that is saying, okay, this person can never go back on the street. They can't be eligible for parole. They need, these different sentences. It's been demonstrated that they are incredibly biased in the ways that we might expect. And so there are some like municipalities in Europe, and I think maybe one county in Florida that is working to completely eradicate their application, and we really think that that's that they really have no place in the courtroom, these systems, that we've been working to increase like human awareness and understanding, and until we can get like people, like we're talking about going back and checking notes, like we can't even do that at 100% or near 100%. So until we can get there, I feel like we're not ready to apply those. So they do exist, but those are the things that I feel like really have dire consequences, like besides just access to healthcare and these like meeting our basic needs. People are literally being sentenced to death by these machines, and so we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you. Are we at time, or is there room for one more question? Or are we at time?
I think we are at time, but Althea will wrap us up, and I'm sure that she'll let everyone know how they can find all of the extra information from today's great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. This was very engaging. Awesome conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yes, this is the end of our webinar. We hope to see you at the next one. Please watch your emails. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar, and we'll also send you the link to where you can find resources. And like I said, thank you for joining us. A big thank you to our panelists for being here. We couldn't have done this without you. And to our audience for being here as well. Thank you, and see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Althea. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.